completed my master's in Latin American Studies with a specialization in political economy from Stanford, and I also have a bachelor's degree in political science and sociology from the Humboldt University in Berlin. Now that you've gotten to know me a little bit better, I'll talk about some of the motivations behind the event tonight before introducing our wonderful guest. So first, according to data from the World Health Organization, criminal violence is the leading cause of bloodshed in the 21st century, and that is particularly pronounced in the developing world. So in this context, scholars are dedicating their work to studying the causes, the mechanisms, and the consequences of criminal activity. One of the recent reports published by the World Bank states that 1 in 4 people on the planet, that is more than 1.5 billion people, live in fragile and conflict-affected states or in countries with very high levels of criminal violence. And because of its unfortunate distinction of being the most unequal region in the world and having some of the most violent cities on the planet, Latin America is predominantly affected by organized criminal groups. Research shows that in places where the state is absent, community members have to organize independently to provide public services and guarantee security. Latin American countries have internal power vacuums increasingly occupied by organized crime, with generalized violence undermining the rule of law and democratic institutions. Many studies about the lack of social order have been conducted using fieldwork in Latin America, and all of them have one finding in common: that the incompetence, the negligence, and the compliance of governments on these issues exacerbate the impacts of criminal violence. So therefore, Latinx in public policy wishes to invite experts on these topics to promote awareness and start a dialogue for public policy reforms and the topic of criminal violence. We are extremely grateful to have Professor Dr. Edgardo Buscaglia with us tonight as our guest speaker. Dr. Buscaglia is a professor at the National University of Buenos Aires and senior scholar in law and economics at Columbia University. He has served as an advisor, directing and implementing anti-mafia programs in collaboration with 119 countries worldwide. His practice focuses on issues involving public policy, money laundering, improving the quality of financial intelligence, and increasing the judicial effectiveness of penal processes aimed at dismantling criminal organizations. He is the president of the Instituto de Acción Ciudadana in Mexico and Central America, an organization that rescues and provides economic and legal assistance to victims of organized crime. He received his PhD and his MA at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, a postdoc in jurisprudence and social policy at UC Berkeley, and his bachelor's from the Universidad de Buenos Aires. After the presentation from Professor Buscaglia, we'll hear from Dr. Hector Cárdenas. Dr. Cárdenas holds a PhD and MPP degrees from the Goldman School of Public Policy, as well as an MPA degree from France École Nationale d'Administration and a BA in International Relations from El Colegio de México. He teaches advanced policy analysis at GSBP at UC Berkeley, and he's active in regulatory reform, government service deliveries, data analytics and visualization, and US-Mexico binational policy issues. He has been a member of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars Working Group of Migration. He is a member of the Mexico's Council on Foreign Relations and served on the Business Advisory Board in California of Nacional Financiera, Mexico's development bank. He has also advised several Mexican federal government agencies, including the Mexican Foreign Ministry on its consular policies and operations in 2009, and the Ministry of Economy since 2001, as well as several other government agencies. Now that I have introduced myself and both of our guests, Professor Dr. Edgardo Buscaglia can start his talk and his presentation, and we'll share the slides. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for such a wonderful introduction. And I thank Hector Gonzalez, Graciela Chong, and many of the team members that made this event possible. I'm very, very glad to be here, linked to this wonderful event that is so close to my social roots. I have been for the past 35 years in touch with victims, with victimizers, and with governments that by many different means were trying to address organized crime. So let me start by moving straight to the topic by defining my discipline because my discipline will determine the methodology that I use in order to reach my conclusions. Now, the law and economics is a discipline that we apply to complex crimes such as human trafficking, trafficking of migrants, trafficking of organs, human organs, trafficking of endangered species, wildlife trafficking, drug trafficking. We have 23 types of complex crimes that we monitor all over the world, and we do it through an organized crime indicator that we developed at the United Nations and before that in the 1990s by measuring 23 types of complex crimes and then by computing a weighted average of those crimes. You will see that indicator very soon. And we have expanded the indicator to 119 countries. Now, the law and economics of complex crimes addresses how legal governance, if you go to the next slide, please, how legal governance, the one before, how legal governance will have an impact on the economics of criminal behavior, how laws and laws in action will have an impact on the economics of criminal behavior. Now, there's a huge gap between the laws in the books and the laws in action. So we also measure that gap through jurimetric indicators. And we also concentrate on analyzing how criminal networks shape laws. You would find it quite interesting to see how criminal networks in Mexico, in many countries around the world, Nigeria, Germany, the United Kingdom, how criminal networks send their lawyers to lobby for specific items within the laws in order for those laws to be weak, in order for those laws to be difficult to implement. So we also find out how criminal networks have an impact on the nature of the law. And in this short presentation, we show how improvements in the actual implementation of a very special law, the United Nations conventions. Each of the United Nations conventions, the Convention Against Organized Crime, the Convention Against Corruption, each of those conventions are an international law, a legal instrument. And they have been ratified by the United States in some cases. Most countries around the world have signed and ratified those laws. And in those laws, you will see all the specific policy actions that countries need to address in cooperation with other countries in order to fight and prevent organized crime. Organized crime is not just a group of people committing crimes in a coordinated fashion. Organized crime is a governance structure, a governance criminal structure that is composed of politicians, legal entrepreneurs. We have civil society organizations involved, and we have the operational staff that are driving trucks. They are in charge of storing drugs and all the logistics that you may imagine, and also in charge of the violence that we have been witnessing in country after country in our region. So if we go to the next slide, please, you will see that the main laws that we assess in their actual implementation are the Mérida Convention, signed in Mérida in the year 2003, the UN Law Against Corruption, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, the United Nations Convention Against Organized Crime, signed in Palermo, Italy in 2000, and then we have 16 laws defining 58 human rights. And each of those human rights is a good or a service. For example, water to drink is a good, is something tangible that we can touch. Water, justice, education, and 58 types of services are involved, and they're all in 16 laws, United Nations laws. Then we also assessed implementation of 40 recommendations are framed within an international organization called the Financial Action Task Force. 40 recommendations to prevent money laundering. And we go country after country performing this field research. And what we try to do is assess the implementation of those laws, of those anti-mafia actions instilled in these conventions by sampling judicial case files, by sampling the actual implementation of regulations to prevent money laundering within the real estate domain, within the accounting domain, within notaries, of course, within the banking system. So we assess if those 40 recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force are actually implemented, not just in the books, but also in practice. When we take samples of organized crime case files, we have 23 types of crimes. As I said before, human trafficking, smuggling, migrants trafficking, human trafficking, drugs trafficking, arms trafficking. So we have many types of, and we select those case files with the most frequent crimes in each country and the most complex crimes that take place. And there we look at, if we go to the next slide, please, we'd look at how countries comply with those international laws, with those United Nations laws. And those United Nations laws have 4 types of policy actions. The first one is within the Article 29 of the UN Convention Against Organized Crime, involve the domestic and international coordination among judges, prosecutors, police intelligence, the prison system, and the economic and financial intelligence units. Those 5 domains, how well they coordinate among each other. You would be amazed to find that in 68% of the countries that we have assessed, that coordination doesn't exist. Prosecutors go one way with a lot of political pressures, undue political pressures. Judges go another way. The police does not coordinate with judges and prosecutors very well. So that's the first domain that is key. And that coordination has to be domestic within the United States, for example, and international, because those international United Nations laws are aimed at having countries coordinating. For example, in the process of obtaining evidentiary material, you need to have many countries cooperating because organized crime is transnational. It operates within many countries at the same time. Then the second area of those laws that we assess is if the 40 recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force are actually implemented by the banks, by real estate agents, by accountants, by notaries, by jewelers. So we try to find out if we see those preventive measures working in place, in action, not just in the books as laws. Then we try to make sure that we assess measures that are inside those United Nations conventions aimed at preventing political corruption. And to prevent political corruption, you need to have preventive audits of political campaign financing, for example, something that does happen in the US. In Germany, you have preventive audits of the political parties, of the candidates, to find out the origins of the money that they use in political campaigns. Then we find out how those primaries are conducted. If they're conducted through discretionary choosing of candidates, or if you have an internal election, open, transparent within each of the parties. We try to assess if political parties, political candidates, if the political campaign laws are addressing measures that are contained within those conventions to prevent the capture of organized crime, of the political system by organized crime. And then the last domain that we assess when we are addressing anti-mafia policies is the social prevention domain. And this is one of the most important domains where the United States is failing very much. That is making sure that civil society has an actual role in preventing that more people will be victims of organized crime, of migrants trafficking, of human trafficking, of drugs trafficking, etc. For example, Italy, that is a country with great practices. You will find that in Italy, they have a law that forces judges to reallocate confiscated assets to civil society networks. So there's a social reallocation of confiscated assets to organized crime. So every asset forfeiture is reallocated to civil society networks in order to serve victims of organized crime. Then you have in countries such as in Brazil, experiments since 1989 in Sao Paulo, for example, where a civil society has the legal right to audit public budgets, public contracts. So civil society does not have the right to access public information or to access the freedom to access information, but also has the right to audit internally state institutions. So those are social prevention measures within Article 31 of the United Nations Convention Against Organized Crime. So the conclusion of our empirical work, just to make sure that we understand the numbers coming next, is that if countries do not implement measures in these 4 areas, organized crime keeps growing in scale and keeps growing in scope in terms of the types of crimes that they commit. Countries that implement more measures within those 4 domains at the same time, simultaneously, are able to reduce the levels of organized crime in accordance to many peer-reviewed articles that we have been publishing since the early 90s. So if we go to the next slide, we will start seeing some jurymetric indicators, I hope. Now you will see an indicator, a jurymetric indicator, measuring if countries do coordinate among those 5 domains internationally and at the domestic level. Judges, prosecutors, police, intelligence, financial intelligence units, customs, tax authorities working within a task force when they address each case of organized crime, human trafficking, migrants trafficking. And in Mexico, for example, they fail incredibly. Except in Costa Rica, Chile, and Uruguay, you don't see task forces working in a coordinated fashion. So if we go to the next graph, you will see the organized crime indicator that we developed in 2001 in an article that you will see at the end within the list of references. And the levels of organized crime, as they go up on the vertical axis, the scope and the scale of organized crime increases. On the horizontal axis, you will see judicial errors in coordinating at the national level and coordinating internationally. When we go to each of those countries, each point is a country, you will see that we sample organized crime cases and we assess if judges and prosecutors and police coordinate with their colleagues in other countries when that coordination is needed. So we have to examine the case file objectively, and then we identify the errors in coordination. And when we find a mistake, a lack of coordination, we communicate that to the prosecutor and to the judges in order to make sure that they understand that they made a mistake. They have to accept that that is a mistake, of course, and then we measure that as an error. So countries that are further to the right on the horizontal axis are countries that are subject to more mistakes in coordinating internationally and nationally. That lack of coordination could be due to lack of training, could be due to corruption, could be due to lack of resources. There are many reasons why they don't coordinate. But as you can see, international coordination works. Countries that coordinate more, in other words, countries that are committing less errors, to the left, down and to the left, for example, Belgium, Italy, you will see that the levels of organized crime are much lower than countries that are not coordinating at all. If you go to the right-hand side, top part of the graph, there you see Nigeria, Afghanistan, Mexico is quite clear up there. So that's the first area that I was talking about before. That's the first domain of the United Nations Conventions against Organized Crime and Against Corruption. We also assess if human rights are violated, the human rights of the accused and the human rights of the victims. So we also include that in our frequency of errors that are committed. So let's go to the next one, please. The next graph will go into the prevention of the social prevention of organized crime. That is what I explained before. Article 31 of the Palermo Convention is aimed at identifying areas, programs where civil society is actually participating in the services, in servicing victims, in providing services to victims or potential victims in red areas based on the reallocation of assets that were confiscated to organized crime. That's one area that we measure quite well. Then other areas that we measure are the auditing programs that Brazil has been famous for. I mentioned this because my colleague who spoke before is from Brazil. There's a very interesting case on social audit, civil society auditing, budget auditing in Brazil and in other 13 democracies around the world. So this is a second area, and as you can see in the next graph, in the next slide, you will see that the same indicator of organized crime is on the vertical axis. In other words, if you go up on the vertical axis, the scale and scope of organized crime goes up. On the horizontal axis, you have the number of programs where you find social prevention of organized crime operating within the countries. And there you see a clear association that later on in some articles that we published years ago, we identify the cause-effect link through a time series. But the point here is that this graph that is not aimed at using the name of each country, is aimed at seeing a worldwide pattern where countries with more social prevention of organized crime, and the United States is not within the best practices, are countries that experience decreases in the frequencies of organized crime. And then we go to the next slide where you will see the third area, the third domain within which the United Nations conventions are recommending public policy actions. That's the area of civil and criminal asset forfeitures, taking away the assets from organized crime, buildings, cars, bank accounts. In each of the case files of organized crime that we sample, for example, in Argentina, you have pieces of evidence in 8 to 12 other countries, depending on the case file. So you need to have a lot of international coordination in order to make that civil and criminal forfeiture real. So if we go to the next graph that is measuring the third area of the UN conventions, the institutional performance of each of those countries, each point is a country as before, you will see that countries that the vertical axis is the same organized crime indicator. On the horizontal axis, you will see that countries that are moving to the right on the horizontal axis are countries that confiscate assets with more frequency in the case files that we examined. So, as you see, more frequent criminal and civil asset forfeitures within the rule of law. In other words, by measuring compliance with 58 human rights. In other words, human rights violations like the ones that are taking place in El Salvador with the Bukele administration would not be computed as a successful indicator in this graph. So we don't accept confiscations of assets by violating due process in this scenario, as you can see in this graph. So countries that confiscate more experience reductions in organized crime indicators. If you want to see the composition of that indicator on the vertical axis, at the end of this presentation, you will see an article that I wrote with my colleague Jan van Dijk at the United Nations. It was published by the United Nations. That was also a peer-reviewed article in a journal called Forum. The title of the article is Controlling Organized Crime and Corruption in the Public Sector. And there you will see the methodology to measure that indicator on the vertical axis. Then we go to the next slide, please. And that's the last domain. And this is interesting because here we measure the implementation, the actual implementation of the United Nations law against corruption, public sector corruption and private sector corruption. And if we go to the next slide, you will see the graph, or you see the same organized crime indicator on the vertical axis, but on the horizontal axis, you will see the actual violations of the two United Nations Conventions against Corruption and Organized Crime on the horizontal axis. So by examining the case files, the judicial case files, you see what articles of the conventions are actually violated. Let me give you an example. The two United Nations Conventions specify techniques of investigation that need to be implemented when you're facing organized crime networks. If those techniques of investigation in cooperation with other countries are not implemented, then we consider that a violation. So each article of the conventions is assessed based on this geometric indicator, and we measure this year after year after year after year. You can see there, for example, Colombia in 2018, Colombia in 2000. As you can see, from 2000 to 2018, Colombia is very far away from being a stable country from an organized crime standpoint. Organized crime still represents a serious problem in Colombia, but the indicators of violations of organized crime and the scope and scale of organized crime types on the vertical axis have decreased in Colombia. However, in Mexico, on the other hand, they have increased. They have gone the other way. From 2000 to 2018, Mexico has experienced an exponential growth of organized crime and an exponential growth in violations of the conventions of the policies against corruption, private sector and public sector corruption. Then we can go to the next one, if that's okay with you. And I want to let you know, within the social prevention of organized crime, we have an area that is very close to my heart, that is basically the actual access to those 58 goods and services that we consider each of them human rights. I mentioned before the access to justice, a service, the access to education, that is also a service, the access to basic health, that is also a service, the access to water. So we have 58 goods and services that are linked. Now, this is something really important in those countries where organized crime is growing out of control and you see high levels of violence, the state fails to guarantee the access to some of those goods and services. And guess who replaces, who substitutes for the state? When the state doesn't provide water, the Sinaloa cartel does. When the state doesn't provide access to justice without corruption, without blockages, the Sinaloa cartel or the Colombian cartels or the Russian criminal networks provide arbitration. They provide mediation. So when human rights are violated, you're creating a social space for organized crime to take over the social fabric and become a governance structure in itself. It replaces the state. And this is what happens in huge areas around the world in most of the countries that we're performing field research. So this is a very important, is in my 2017 piece that is referenced at the end of this PDF file. So if we go to the next one, to the next slide, please, you will see the list of 58 human rights in accordance to the United Nations Conventions. And the economic analysis of human rights, first of all, we consider each human right an actual service that needs to be accessed, a public service, a quasi-public service that needs to be accessed in order to assess if organized crime has the space to take over the social fabric. And one of the main pillars of organized crime as a governance structure is the social capture of towns, the social capture of cities, the social capture of pieces of society where they obtain protection, and of course, the political capture of public officials that provide protection for them to expand. Now, we have organized crime all over the world, as you can see from my graphs. There's no country in the world without organized crime. Now, organized crime does not behave like in Mexico or like in countries like Afghanistan, where organized crime commits crimes against humanity. When you have this United Nations conventions implemented. When organized crime does not have any barriers, they become violent, they compete without controls, and they behave like they behave in Mexico. When you have the 45 institutional controls specified in the United Nations Conventions Against Corruption and Organized Crime, there are 45 types of institutions that provide barriers for organized crime not to grow. Organized crime, of course, will be there. Smuggling cigarettes, smuggling cars, like in Sweden, smuggling drugs, also like in Europe, but they will not be engaged in crimes against humanity in a violent, extreme violent way, like you see in Central America, you can see in Mexico and other regions around the world, and you start to see in Argentina lately, very much. So strengthening the access to this 58 human rights is a way to fight organized crime, the expansion of organized crime within the social domain. If we go to the next one, so I can finish, so I don't want to take more time. This is basically what I just said. And then we go to the next one, and that's, I think, the end of the presentation, because here you have everything that I said before in numbers. When you violate the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, when you violate that convention less than before, like Chile, Italy, that has decreased the number of violations from 2000 to 2020, and organized crime will go down, if you see the third column. So you see the third column, clear decreases in the organized crime indicators. But when violations to the United Nations Against Corruption go up 82%, for example, in Mexico from 2000 to 2020, organized crime goes up incredibly, 2,034%. Colombia has reduced the number of violations to the convention. Organized crime is reduced. Now, of course, everything has to be within a human rights domain. As you can see in Chile, in Italy, human rights violations in those case files that we sampled, they have gone down. In Mexico, human rights violations by state officials have gone up 24.7%. So we measure the human rights domain as a necessary condition for those UN instruments to be successful. The other three columns that you see at the end, they measure if countries have more frequent forfeitures, if countries cooperate more frequently than before, and if social networks, civil society networks, are receiving confiscated assets on the last column, with more frequency or less frequency. So this is very interesting because we're measuring all the domains of the UN conventions against organized crime and corruption, and we also measure the compliance with human rights rules and standards within the UN. And they all go hand by hand. When countries adopt mano dura, the approach of going after people like they do in El Salvador without due process, in an indiscriminate fashion, or when the army takes over security roles without concern about detaining people with a legal motivation. You will be amazed that when you go to Chiapas, for example, 72% of the arrests do not have a legal motivation. You don't see any authority justifying legally why the person was arrested, was detained. So when that happens, organized crime keeps going up. So what Bukele is doing in El Salvador will make organized crime go up. This is what we predict. Of course, not this year, not next, but it will go up within the time frame that we are measuring right now. And thank you very much. That the last one now is exactly what I said before. If you comply, the next slide, if you comply with the 4 domains of the UN Convention, like you see here, organized crime indicators will go down. Organized crime understood as transnational organized crime and understood as criminal structures, government structures that are composed of politicians, legal enterprises, civil society, fronts, and of course, the operational people that you see in the newspapers with guns. Thank you so much for your patience, and I look forward to exchanging views with you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Buscaglia, for this wonderful and insightful presentation. We will now hear comments from our panelist, Dr. Hector Cárdenas.
Thank you, Isabella. Thank you, Edgardo, for that excellent presentation and very suggestive data that you present. I thought I would center my comments really very closely on what you presented. I'm sorry if I repeat some of the things that you already said, but I think it's well worth insisting on some of the insights that I see here. So the first thing that strikes me is that if I was looking at the data correctly, and of course you didn't present it exactly in this way, so there may be some extrapolating too much from the visual, but it seems to me that the first really interesting insight is that the increase in organized crime indicators is not a monotonic function of either inequality or poverty, right? I could see from the data that you have extremely unequal and extremely poor countries dotted all along the line, maybe not at in the very quarter where you have the best performers, but everywhere else you see them there in different places. So that's sort of one first insight that I think is a little counterintuitive, where you say, well, it's not just about poverty and it's not just about inequality. There are other factors at stake, more institutional, organizational, sort of policy implementation factors. And that's sort of the second insight that I get from your research, is that we really are dealing in many cases with the problem of implementation. I would have liked to have seen in your graphics how many of the countries that are the really bad performers have actually subscribed all of these international agreements, right? So, because I know just from a few of them, I know Mexico, for example, is a top subscriber. Mexico is subscribed to everything. It has everything's on its books. In fact, it has legal jurisprudence that in recent years has said that its international treaty obligations are superior even to constitutional domestic law, which is, a far cry from what most countries say about what the obligations of the state are in terms of fulfilling its international obligations, right? And so Mexico has a very, very high standard of adherence, at least on paper, right, to these rules, and it is a signatory of many of these conventions, if not all of them. I don't know for a fact that it's signed all of them, but I think a very high percentage of them are signed by Mexico. I'm sure it's the same case for some other underperformers. And so it's not about what laws you have on the books, it's about how they are actually implemented, right? And it's about how public policies, whether they are legally adopted or not, how are they actually rolled out on the ground, right, at the ground level? And I think that's one of the real treasures of the research that you're doing, is that you are going all the way down to the judicial case file and looking at exactly what's happening in specific cases to be able to gauge that gap between what the law says and the way the law is actually implemented. And so when you think about the problems of implementation, and I have had the opportunity to work on a couple of projects over the years that have to do with judicial reform implementation, especially the Mexican criminal justice reform of 2006, 2016, where there was an overhaul of the whole judicial process for criminal law, and you had a very, very grave and serious problem of implementation, right? You have a very big overhaul, some very big ideas, a very big law, very big reform, and then very poor implementation. And this would be the sort of second thing, is very uneven implementation. You mentioned the importance of these 5 actors, of the coordination of these 5 actors, right? The judiciary, the prosecutors, the police investigators, the prison system, and of course the financial and intelligence agencies that look, especially for money laundering, etc. And what you see there, at least in the case of Mexico, is a great degree of variance in the quality of those services, right? Of those agencies. So you have the judiciary that has been, I think, I'd love to hear your opinion on that if you have one. I think the judiciary has gotten better, but not so the prosecution, not so prosecutors, and not so police, and not so prisons either. I think the financial intelligence agencies have also gotten a bit better, but they're hampered by the fact that they have to work with these other agencies that just don't function. And so you've got that. So the problem of implementation is really, it seems to me that it's crucial in this area. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. And when you think about implementation, you're thinking about quality of institutions, yes, how is the system designed, but also the quality of organizations, the organizational capabilities on the ground. And then, of course, processes, systems, and monitoring and evaluation. And another insight that I found extraordinarily interesting is how, when you socialize monitoring and evaluation through these civil society engagement in actually doing auditing, being involved in the process of understanding what is going well and what is not working, you get much better results, right? And that's really, really important. I wonder, I'd like to sort of maybe prod you a little bit more just to engage with one obvious, perhaps very obvious objection that somebody might make to some of the research, which is just to understand in which direction does the causality really moving, right? Is it that organized crime invades vacuums that are created by the state? Or is it that organized crime, when it gets out of control, it pushes the state out, right? Is organized crime moving into places where the state has retreated? Or is it the other way around? Is it the state just reacting, a state that is failing in delivering the basic services that it needs to deliver, a state that doesn't have a good police force, that doesn't have a good judiciary, that doesn't have a good prosecutorial system? Is it the state that retreats first, or is it the organized crime that pushes the state out, right? Because I think it's not just a semantic issue. I think it really does matter in terms of the kinds of policy prescriptions that we might put in place in order to regain that space and to bring the state back and to be able to deal with organized crime. It's encouraging to see that there are some real success stories. Chile is a definite success story, and that there's something that they've done correctly. Now, I think also that Chile and your data, you're showing your data in terms of percentage changes, but perhaps we're talking about baseline values that are very different, right? I suspect that the Chilean baseline value for the incidence of organized crime is a much lower baseline value than Colombia or Mexico, right? So it would be interesting just to see it in a less relative way. How does that actually work in practice? Are there examples of countries that have gone from a very high baseline and actually been able to reduce it significantly through these kinds of interventions of strengthening these institutions and strengthening the application of these kinds of conventions, or did they have to do something else? So anyway, I don't want to take too much time. I want to make sure that we get to discuss this with you at more length, because it's a fascinating work that you're doing, and I really appreciated hearing your conclusions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cardenas, for your comments. We'll now hear from Dr. Buscaglia and hear a response to these critiques, and then we'll jump to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cardenas. Wonderful comments because you make me, you bring an earthquake to my brain. This is this is exactly the kind of discussion that I appreciate. Yes, there is an issue. Poverty is not a factor in any way causing organized crime or more corruption. You have countries within the poverty levels that you see in Benin, in Africa next to Nigeria. You see countries with poverty levels that are still significant, like in Costa Rica, with levels of governance that are much higher than in other countries with in much higher levels of wealth. So that point is well taken. We wrote a piece with Pilar Domingo many years ago about that, but I didn't want to expand too much. But I look forward to exchanging material with you, if you like, where I can show you some old pieces where we explore the lack of links between poverty and organized crime and corruption. Then you have a very good, excellent point when you talk about the cause effect linked to state vacuums. You have it both ways. You have areas where the state does not allocate budgets for basic human rights, for access to justice, where people have to walk for miles, or water, where people have to walk for miles and miles to access water, where there's no budget in the public sector, that you see that there's a clear allocation. And you have, of course, organized crime corrupting the federal prosecutors in Mexico, for example, and paralyzing the federal prosecution, and therefore creating a domain for organized crime to take over the social fabric. So it goes both ways. It's a feedback loop taking place that explains much of that state vacuum approach. We have an indicator measuring, going to another comment you made, measuring the gap between the laws in the books and the laws in action. And we bring Colombia and Mexico. Colombia has complied with almost 100% of the United Nations conventions against corruption and organized crime in the books, 100%. In action, you have Colombia within the 80-something% of law in action, practical compliance. Mexico is a nightmare scenario. You have Mexico complying with more than 80% of the clauses of the UN Convention against Corruption and against Organized Crime. But when we go to the large sample of judicial case files, basically the actual compliance is below 20%. So you have a huge gap between the laws in actions and laws in the books. So that we measured, not all over the world, but in some specific countries where organized crime was a serious governance problem and was causing political instability, like in the case of Mexico and Colombia. So if there's any other point that I'm not mentioning, please let me know. I'm always willing to address it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was such a productive discussion, and now we are opening the floor to questions from anyone. You can either just raise your hand and speak, but I can also read the question. So maybe I can start with the one that is already in the chat, and I'll read this one, and then we'll jump to Juan's question. So the first question from Diego is, thinking of paramilitarism as an organized crime structure that is becoming increasingly present at a global scale, and your assertion that these structures take over in the absence of the state, I have two brief questions. First, what do you think are the main functions that these types of criminal structures serve to advance neoliberal models of national development? Second, what are some other ways that these organized criminal structures, aside from hiring lawyers to lobby governments, seek legitimacy?
Wonderful. The paramilitary structures that you see in many countries around the world are due to two main factors. One could be the outgrowth of criminality, of organized crime. Having paramilitary groups challenging the state and providing security for their organized. That's the case of the Zetas, Los Zetas in Mexico. But then you have paramilitary outgrowth from legitimate citizen movements. When you have state vacuums, the absence of the state within vast areas of Guerrero, for example. And there you can see legitimate paramilitary groups that are growing as a result of the absence of the state or very corrupt structures of the state within areas of several countries that we have worked in. I mentioned Mexico because I was asked to focus on Mexico, but you could find those structures also in Guatemala, you could find them in Colombia, you can find them in many places. So you have to make a difference between those two paramilitary outgrowths. Then organized crime seeks to legalize their assets to become part of the legal system. In a book that we published in 2015, based on the data provided by Professor Schneider in Austria, we have documented countries where dirty money is originated with more frequency and countries where dirty money is finally integrated into the legal economy. It would not surprise you that the United States is the focus, the final destination for 22% of all the money laundering in the planet, and the European Union 21%. So the final destination means that after the dirty money originates in the buying and selling of human beings, for example, in Nigeria or in Mexico, then the money goes through a process of hiding, restructuring, and through many transactions in many countries, and is finally integrated in the countries with stronger rule of law. So the paradox, one of the main paradoxes that we see in this empirical work, is that organized crime seeks the rule of law when they want to launder money. They want to launder their money, integrate their money in countries with very high levels of protection of private property, where the rule of law is actually stronger. There's another paradox that I didn't mention before, that is that when the state faces organized crime only with force, only with mano dura, soldiers, police, like one of the presidential candidates is proposing now in Argentina, Patricia Bullrich, what you see is that organized crime grows when you do not implement the other areas of the UN conventions, when you don't have social prevention, when you don't have frequent asset forfeitures, when you don't have prevention of political corruption, and you just send more and more soldiers. Organized crime reallocates their money to buy those soldiers, to buy those added public officials. So corruption goes up and organized crime goes up. That's called the paradox of expected punishment. It was published in the Journal of Law and Economics in 2008. So that's another paradox that brings to mind. So more repression without the rule of law elements of the UN conventions, more soldiers, more police, more mano dura. The Bukele approach now brings more organized crime, brings more corruption, and of course, brings more paramilitary movements as a result. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you.
If I could just,
yes, of course.
Add
Sorry.
something to what Professor Buscaglia just mentioned, because I think it's a really important point. I think that there's a lot of devil in the details of how policies rolled out, right? So for example, in Mexico during the Calderon administration, you began with a very, with putting the military on the streets in Michoacan. And that was a situation where you had very localized problem of paramilitary-like criminal organizations, both the drug dealers, and then you had the paramilitary organizations that had come up because of legitimate concerns about both from communities and sometimes from businesses that had organized themselves to defend themselves against the criminal actors. And so they had
Legitimate.
Yeah, exactly. So they came over, and when the military came in, initially you actually had some success because the levels of violence went down. The military was able to control things. Then, when the government expanded that strategy to a broader part of the country, you started to have a lot of problems because you had exactly what Professor Buscaglia mentions. You had a lot of violations of human rights, and you have a lot of issues with the army overstepping its reaches. Then they readjusted again. And in the last part of the Calderon administration, you have a much more sophisticated understanding of how to do law enforcement. So, for example, you had this campaign, which was called Todos Somos Juárez, which was basically the government poured enormous amounts of resources, but not just military and police, but also educational and social and community organizing into Juárez, and that had an enormous effect. In fact, Juárez became quite a peaceful city for a few years, right? So there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of detail in how these things pan out, right? And there's quality of policies, no?
Yeah, we are dealing with scarce time, but you are right, Professor. I think that the Juárez case is a good example of a change in strategy with good results in the short term. But Juárez is not isolated from the Mexican planet. so sooner or later, things started to happen. Look, in Durango, we had a huge war scenario during a period of 7 years. Zetas against Sinaloa cartel, with huge numbers of people killed, disappeared. And when the Sinaloa cartel took over and they started to literally determine who was going to be the state attorney general, who was going to be the governor, the Sinaloa cartel really took over. The levels of crime went down incredibly through a pax mafiosa. So that's another scenario that you see in Mexico, that violence goes down because one group takes over and they really control, they provide a monopoly of power within a specific domain. So no, the Mexican experience is very rich in diverse experiences, and I agree with you on that. So I really look forward to many hours exchanging views with you and with other colleagues there, because each of you has very diverse knowledge that, of course, I don't have here, that I would like to make sure that I have access to in the next few years. So feel free to organize anything else. I'm always willing to exchange views within this very complex topic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Buscaglia and Dr. Cardenas. I understand that you might have to leave, but we do have some more questions in the chat. So I don't know if I should ask them now, if
Yeah.
we should
Go ahead.
Yes,
Yeah,
okay,
go ahead.
Great.
Whenever you
I
like.
think Juan, you had one question, right?
Oh gosh, I have like 100 million questions that I would love to ask, but in the interest of time,
Here I am all night. I don't sleep. So.
Sure. It looks like here, thank you very much for presenting. I think here we're kind of dealing with like different levels, an international level, a domestic level, but aggregated at the national level. And then you can disaggregate that domestic level and kind of start thinking about the subnational level, right? And I think this is kind of like what Hector was kind of, some of the themes he was tapping on, that this might be a local issue, right? So I'm just kind of curious, to what extent does the local issue actually matter for determining these outcomes that we really, want to understand here, those related to organized crime and things. And I guess more importantly, to what extent do politics play in actually shaping organized crime dynamics at the local level? Because there's been a lot of research in recent years, at least in my field in political science, that kind of talk about some of the coordination issues that you mentioned, when police don't want to kind of work across different agencies with each other. Some try to ascribe a political logic to that. And it might be the case that, it's not just the case that state police forces don't want to work with municipal police forces and vice versa. The problem is that the political parties across the two levels of government are not politically aligned. So this might be a partisanship or a polarization issue. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on that. And I think, I'm sorry. And, I have other questions too. One of them is like on the mano dura thing. You mentioned earlier that, without barriers, organized crime groups are going to react with violence. But I feel like, mano dura is basically a barrier, and they did react with, violence with that. And I was just wondering if maybe there could be some kind of bell curve effect going on here where repression could work to a certain extent, but eventually it's going to produce more violence in the long term. It's not going to be a very sustainable solution. Sometimes there's this thing called a cockroach effect when the state comes in, cracks down, let's say performs a Michoacanazo, and all of a sudden the violence spills over into neighboring states. And I'm curious to see if those are some of the mechanisms that you've seen in your research as well. Thank you.
What happens at the local level does matter. When you go to areas of Guerrero where the social fabric, specific ethnic groups enjoy informal institutions, could be linked to public security, it could be linked to the provision of water or any other. You see that the effects of organized crime are lower. You see less capture of organized crime of those areas where the social fabric has already informal institutions working for a long time. Also within the social control domain, auditing authorities. So you see a lot of that, for example, in Guerrero, in some areas of Guerrero. Then regarding how all those short circuits among the 5 areas that I mentioned before, I was a witness of how the then anti-mafia prosecutor in Mexico, his name was Jose Luis Santiago Vasconcelos. He used to tell me that Genaro Garcia Luna, the guy who was sentenced in Brooklyn a few weeks ago, that he was literally linked to the Beltran Leiva cartel. And in those days, it was if you were inside the system, sampling case files from the anti-mafia unit of Jose Luis Santiago Vasconcelos, you knew that. We had the affidavit of 23 bodyguards of Genaro Garcia Luna in 2008, documenting his meetings with Beltran Leiva, with the Beltran Leiva cartel. So all those things generated short circuits. Those were objective factors, hard data. You have an affidavit, you have the testimony of an anti-mafia prosecutor in Mexico stating that the chief of the police, the minister of security, was linked to organized crime. So of course you will have a huge earthquake within that institutional domain, and institutions don't work otherwise. In Argentina, happens what you just stated. In Argentina, when we wanted to establish a task force in the province of Santa Fe with the Socialista government of Santa Fe, and we wanted to have a task force with provincial authorities and federal authorities sitting down, of course, customs, the federal tax authorities, the provincial tax authorities, the federal prosecutor, the provincial prosecutor. The federal authorities did not allow the federal officials to go to that task force because of political competition, because of party clashes. The Peronistas, the Kirchneristas, against the Socialistas. So that was blocking the implementation of. So you have different cases in different countries, very much going in the direction that you pointed out. So I think I'm forgetting one point that you made that I'm not addressing. Please remind me. I'm getting old.
It was on the mano dura taking many forms, and some places that it works and other places it doesn't. It's like a bell curve.
I was going to. That's an excellent point. Look, Dictatorships, authoritarian regimes like in China or Russia, they do control organized crime. They incorporate, they bring organized crime into the state, and they use organized crime for strategic state purposes. You see organized crime in Russia involved in the trafficking of strategic minerals that the Russian state considers key. You have Russian organized crime committing homicides of political dissidents in other countries. So organized crime in a dictatorship, of course, they reduce the level of chaos and they comply with, they're like the tentacle of an octopus. To some degree, they become one more arm, one more public policy arm of the state. You see that in China linked to illegal fishing, for example. You see organized crime providing the infrastructure for illegal fishing in many areas where you see state enterprises involved in illegal fishing in the South Atlantic right now. So organized crime and dictatorships are very interesting because when you have extreme forms of authoritarian regimes, usually you have what we called in an article state organized crime. So organized crime, of course, the most sophisticated transnational organized crime serves the state, of course, with an economic benefit in mind, with a financial benefit in mind. That is the main purpose of organized crime. So to some degree, mano dura does work in order to reduce the most extreme forms of violence. But when you have situations like with Bukele, where you don't have a very efficient authoritarian regime within that place, and you have challenges to his authority, then you will have some short circuits. Organized crime will not be that disciplined. I'm trying to answer that as fast as I can.
If I can be authoritarian myself and insert my own question to this topic.
Please do.
Yeah. So my focus is mostly in Brazil, as I mentioned before. And I think the points that you raised about authoritarian regimes and organized crime is extremely interesting. But I think in thinking about the Brazilian case, the logic was the causality was kind of the other way around. So after the military dictatorship took place and those high security prisons were built, especially in very remote areas and where prisoners were put together, very violent criminals put together with former guerrilla members. That was, and then extremely high levels of human rights abuses. Those groups sort of created this ideology against the violence from the state, and that's how the first prison gangs emerged. And then you had all this, from prison gangs, extremely highly organized criminal groups that developed in Brazil. So I'm wondering, how do you see this logic playing out in different contexts? Is it sometimes the implementation of an authoritarian regime that can even have as a discourse controlling crime and controlling corruption and controlling society as a whole as sort of an attempt to mitigate crime? Or when is it the other way around, when does authoritarianism causes crime and rebellion in this case?
Well, we have cases, I thank you very much, because I was not aware of many of the details of the Brazilian case, so I look forward to reading some of that. Thanks so much. The FARC was born as a political movement, and some of that repression that took place that in Colombia for many decades, from that very famous decade of the 1940s onwards, they generated violent expressions of political movements that later on derived in forms of organized crime in order to finance their activities. So you have many cases where the lack of open democratic processes, in other words, when you close the door to the expression of political movements in specific areas, you will generate violent political movements, but at the same time, you will generate an organized crime appendix to those movements that will grow in place. And in some cases, like with the FARC, the political movement was taken over by organized crime at the end, at the very end. Something that is actually very sad, but that's what happened based on our publications in the 1990s when we visited Putumayo, we visited many areas, and at some point, the mid-level leaders of the FARC were losing sight of the political objective, and they were actually more concerned about the money that they were obtaining at the very front. So yes, it's a very diverse experience that you can have. There's not one explanation involved in addressing dictatorships. Use organized crime for their purposes, and they use them for many purposes. During the Soviet Union days, in the old days, the Georgian criminal networks were used to import caviar, champagne, so they had specific uses within the state domain. Of course, they were allowed other trafficking that was not within the state domain, but in order for those criminal networks to be allowed to exist, the state was actually using some of that criminal structure for strategic purposes, for their own purposes. So it's a very interesting case, and China is a case in point right now in the last 10 years. Thank you so much for the question. I hope that I provided some answer to your good point. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So now I'll ask one of the questions from the chat. The first one is, does the culture and traditions of a former colonizing power tells us anything about the degree and type of organized crime presence in different countries?
A very good point. Professor Catarina Pistor from Colombia, she delved for many years in order to, she tried to answer that question with geometric indicators. Fascinating. She's a professor at the law school. And she tried to find out if those countries where you have copy-paste legal transplant as a byproduct of colonies, if those countries experience more crime because of the fact that the culture of legality is much weaker. Of course, I can imagine myself not having much respect for the law if the law that is imposed on me from the top down comes from a colonial power, like in many African countries or Latin American countries, especially if that law was a copy-paste imposition and was not adapted to the uses and customs of the country. So to the degree Catarina Pistor, Professor Pistor proved that in countries where you have legal transplants that were adapted to the uses and customs, they provide more culture of legality than in other countries where colonies were just imposed a copy-paste without adaptation, without cultural adaptation. And of course, the culture of legality was much weaker. And as a result, you have more corruption within the political and social fabrics and more organized crime as a result. So Professor Pistor performed a wonderful empirical work of that question. So thank you for the question. Great.
Thank you so much. The last question that we have in the chat is that you mentioned, Professor Buscaglia, that poverty level is not related to the level of crime, or at least not directly. So does the disparity of wealth between the rich and the poor, so a measure of inequality, correlate with level of crime?
I mentioned that the poverty levels is not correlated with the frequencies of organized crime. Organized crime is not your typical common crime. There are different levels of crimes that could be linked to inequality, especially when that inequality is developed by a regime, a political regime, that generates different types of violence that could be measured as crimes. No, but when organized crime is a structure, it's a governance structure composed of politicians, legal entrepreneurs, civil society movements with great funding. So usually you see that in countries where lots of dirty money is moving around without any kind of prevention. Argentina is one area where you see that the political class does not want to move on basic prevention of organized crime, prevention of money laundering. And of course, you see more organized crime growing with more poverty and with less poverty. Organized crime was growing when poverty in Argentina was going down from 2001 to 2011, was growing a lot. Then it keeps growing with poverty is going up. So the fact that poverty went down in Argentina a lot from 2001 to 2011 did not stop organized crime from growing. So that's one example of what I mean. Organized crime, not common crime, not the simple type of crime. I'm not talking about homicides or the theft of a car. So thank you for the question very much.
So any final questions? One more chance. No? Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Buscaglia, for your time, for the presentation, for answering all the questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Cardenas, for all your helpful comments and also helping Dr. Buscaglia with one of the questions. This was a wonderful panel. I'm so grateful that I got to be the moderator. It's always a bit weird over Zoom, but I guess we had a really productive discussion. So thank you so much. I really appreciate all of this.
I'm the one who is
And
grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
you
you.
very much. Wonderful, wonderful talk.